Hey folks, welcome back to another night of absolutely bizarre dream stories. Tonight we're diving into something that'll probably make you appreciate your nice, safe, dry bedroom, the haunting experiences of seasoned sailors who found themselves drowning in impossible waters while tucked safely in their beds on solid ground. So before you settle in for the night, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but honestly, only if you actually enjoy these weird historical sleep stories. And I'd love to know where you're drifting off from tonight and what time it is there. Are you listening from a cozy apartment in Manchester at midnight? A dorm room in Tokyo at 3 a.m.? Drop a comment. It's fascinating to see our global community of insomniacs and dream enthusiasts. Now, grab your favorite blanket, dim those lights, and prepare to explore the terrifying world of maritime nightmares that plagued experienced mariners throughout history. And hey, if you fall asleep halfway through, that's exactly what we're going for here. So picture this, it's 1847 in Portsmouth, England, and Captain William Henley has just retired after 37 years sailing the world's most dangerous waters. And when I say dangerous, I mean waters that would make modern sailors grateful for GPS, weather satellites, and the kind of safety equipment that actually keeps you alive instead of just making you feel slightly less doomed. This guy had survived 3 shipwrecks, not little bumps against the dock, but full-scale abandoned ship and prey to whatever gods might be listening, disasters. He'd weathered 2 hurricanes that destroyed entire fleets, the kind of storms where the waves are taller than cathedral spires and the wind sounds like the world ending. He'd navigated through ice fields in the Arctic, where one wrong turn meant being crushed between moving mountains of frozen death, and he'd crossed tropical waters where diseases killed more sailors than storms ever did. Henley was what you'd call a proper old salt, weathered face like leather left in the sun too long, hands scarred from rope burns and knife cuts, and that particular way of walking that comes from spending decades adjusting to rolling decks. He had stories that could fill libraries and scars that mapped out a career spent dancing with death on the high seas. At 61 years old, he'd finally saved enough prize money and trading profits to buy himself a comfortable retirement in a nice house exactly 4 miles inland from the nearest drop of seawater. 4 miles might not sound like much, but for a man who'd spent most of his adult life never being more than a few steps from oceanic immersion, it represented a psychological journey to an entirely different world. Henley had chosen this specific location deliberately, close enough to Portsmouth that he could still smell salt in the air when the wind was right, but far enough inland that he couldn't see water from any window in his house. He wanted to ease into land life gradually, like a swimmer getting used to shallow water. The house itself was everything a retired sea captain could want: solid brick construction that wouldn't roll or pitch in any weather, a fireplace that would provide consistent warmth without depending on wind direction, and enough rooms that he could spread out his maritime collection without everything smelling like tar and rope. His wife Eleanor had been looking forward to this retirement for years, dreaming of a husband who would sleep through the night without jolting awake to check imaginary rigging during landlocked storms. But starting on his very first night as a landlubber, literally his first night sleeping in a bed that wasn't bolted to anything, Henley began experiencing what he described in his journal as the most real dreams that weren't real. And honestly, that description still gives me chills, because there's something absolutely terrifying about experiences that feel more authentic than actual reality. Every single night, without fail, regardless of what he ate, how much he drank, what time he went to bed, or how exhausted he was, Henley would find himself drowning in his own bedroom. But this wasn't just, oh no, I'm underwater. This was full sensory drowning with maritime precision that only someone who'd actually experienced it could imagine. Think about what drowning in seawater actually involves, because it's different from drowning in fresh water in ways that most people never consider. Seawater has a specific density that affects buoyancy. You sink differently in salt water than in fresh water. It has a particular temperature that varies by location, and seasoned Arctic seawater feels different on your skin than tropical seawater. And it has that distinctive taste and burning sensation when it enters your respiratory system, a flavor and pain that's absolutely unmistakable once you've experienced it. In Henley's dreams, He would feel salt water filling his lungs with that exact burning sensation that comes from inhaling seawater instead of air. He could taste the precise briny flavor that differs depending on which ocean you're in, and Henley had tasted them all. North Atlantic seawater has a different mineral profile than Pacific seawater. Mediterranean seawater tastes different from Caribbean seawater. And in his dreams, Henley could identify exactly which oceanic waters were drowning him based on taste alone. He would feel the crushing pressure of being deep underwater, his chest constricting as his lungs fought for air that wasn't available. But here's where these dreams became truly disturbing and genuinely impossible. He could see his bedroom, sealing through what appeared to be 20 feet of crystal clear ocean water. Not murky dream water. Not symbolic water, actual seawater with the kind of clarity you only find in specific oceanic conditions. The floral wallpaper his wife Eleanor had chosen. The oil lamp on his nightstand that provided their evening light. His clothes hanging in the wardrobe where he'd carefully arranged his civilian retirement outfits, all perfectly visible through this impossible aquatic lens while he thrashed and struggled against currents that seemed to be pulling him deeper into his own mattress. But wait, it gets stranger. Henley wasn't just drowning in static water, he was experiencing actual ocean currents in his bedroom. Tidal flows that pushed him toward his bedroom window, undertows that tried to drag him under his bed. The kinds of complex water movements that you only encounter in real oceanic environments where multiple forces are affecting water, dynamics simultaneously. He could feel specific types of seaweed brushing against his skin, not dream seaweed, but particular species that he recognized from his sailing days. Kelp from cold northern waters, seagrass from tropical shallows, the kind of marine vegetation that grows in specific oceanic zones under particular temperature and depth conditions. His dream journal contains detailed descriptions of underwater plant life that were botanically accurate for species he'd encountered during his sailing career. The weirdest part, and this is where things move from strange into genuinely inexplicable territory, was that his wife Eleanor would find him each morning soaking wet with actual salt water. Not sweat. Eleanor knew the difference between perspiration and seawater after 37 years of marriage to a sailor. Not regular water from their wash basin or drinking pitcher, genuine seawater that left actual salt crystals on his skin and sheets when it evaporated. Eleanor would wake up to find her husband's nightshirt drenched with brine that smelled exactly like the Portsmouth harbor, but with mineral traces that seemed to come from deeper, more distant waters. Their bed sheets would be saturated with enough salt water to fill several buckets. Despite their bedroom being 4 miles from the nearest ocean and having no plausible source for such quantities of seawater, the local doctor, Pemberton, was completely baffled when Eleanor brought him in for a consultation. Dr. Pemberton had treated sailors for decades. He knew about seasickness, scurvy, injuries from rigging accidents, and all the standard maritime medical conditions. But he'd never encountered a retired sailor who was somehow producing gallons of genuine ocean water in his sleep while living miles inland. Dr. Pemberton tested the water that Eleanor collected from their bed sheets, and his analysis confirmed that it was genuine seawater with the exact salinity and mineral content of ocean water. Not artificially mixed salt water, not water with salt added to it, actual seawater with the complex chemical composition that develops in oceanic environments over time. More mysteriously, the seawater seemed to contain microscopic marine life, tiny organisms that could only survive in oceanic conditions. Dr. Pemberton found plankton, algae, and other marine microorganisms in the water samples, despite the fact that these creatures couldn't possibly survive in a landlocked bedroom or be transported there through any known means. Henley tried everything he could think of to stop these aquatic nightmares. He slept in different rooms, thinking maybe there was something about their bedroom that was triggering the dreams. He tried Eleanor's sewing room, the parlor, even the kitchen floor. Didn't matter. Every night, the same drowning dream in impossible seawater that somehow manifested in physical reality. He stayed at his daughter Margaret's house for a week, sleeping in her spare bedroom that had never been near the ocean. Still woke up drowning in salt water. He spent 3 nights at the local inn, the Anchor and Crown, sleeping in beds that dozens of other people had used without any oceanic incidents. The innkeeper was not amused to discover his guest producing buckets of seawater that soaked through the mattress and left salt stains on the wooden floor. Henley even tried staying awake for entire nights, thinking that if he didn't sleep, he couldn't have the drowning dreams. But exhaustion would eventually force him into unconsciousness, and he'd wake up a few hours later, still drenched in salt water despite having been awake and dry when fatigue finally overcame him. The psychological impact of these dreams was devastating for a man who had successfully navigated some of the world's most dangerous waters. Henley had faced down storms, pirates, mutinous crews, and maritime disasters that would have broken lesser men. But being unable to sleep peacefully in his own bed was destroying his confidence and his sense of reality in ways that actual ocean dangers never had. Eleanor documented the progression of her husband's condition in her own journal, noting that the dreams seemed to be getting more intense rather than fading over time. Initially, Henley would wake up slightly damp with a lingering taste of salt. But as weeks passed, he'd wake up completely soaked, gasping and coughing as if he'd actually been underwater for extended periods. Dr. Pemberton suggested that perhaps Henley's years at sea had created some kind of psychological association between sleep and maritime environments that was somehow manifesting physically. But this theory couldn't explain the genuine seawater, the marine microorganisms, or the specific oceanic conditions that Henley was experiencing in his bedroom. After 3 months of this aquatic torment, 3 months of sleepless nights, salt-stained sheets, and the growing fear that he was losing his mind, Henley made a decision that probably saved his sanity and quite possibly his life. He packed up their household, sold their inland house, and moved back to the coast. But not just anywhere on the coast. Henley took a position as harbor master in Portsmouth, the same port where he'd begun and ended countless voyages during his sailing career. It wasn't retirement in the traditional sense, but it was work that kept him connected to maritime life without requiring him to actually go to sea. The harbor master position was perfect for a man with Henley's experience and his particular psychological needs. He could watch ships come and go, advise captains about weather conditions and port regulations, and maintain his connection to the maritime world that had defined his entire adult life. But he could also sleep in his own bed every night, surrounded by the sounds and smells of harbor life that his subconscious apparently required for peaceful rest. The drowning dream stopped immediately, literally the first night he slept within sight and sound of Portsmouth Harbor. No more salt water in the bed. No more impossible oceanic currents in the bedroom. No more marine life appearing mysteriously in their bedsheets. Eleanor was so relieved that she didn't complain about the smell of tar and fish that now drifted through their bedroom windows or the sound of ships' bells and dockwork that continued throughout the night. Henley lived another 12 years as harbor master, and he never had another maritime nightmare. But Eleanor noted in her journal that her husband never slept as soundly inland as he did within sound of the harbor. It was as if his subconscious had negotiated a treaty with his conscious mind: stay near the water where you belong, and we'll stop trying to drown you in your sleep. What I find most fascinating about Henley's story is how it suggests that some people develop such a deep psychological connection to their professional environment that retirement can feel like a form of death to their unconscious minds. His subconscious wasn't just missing the sea, it was actively trying to recreate oceanic conditions in whatever environment his body happened to be sleeping in. Makes you wonder how many people are fighting similar battles with their unconscious minds, trying to retire from work that has become so fundamental to their identity that their sleeping brains refuse to accept the change. Maybe the reason so many people struggle with retirement isn't just about losing purpose or income. Maybe it's about trying to convince your subconscious to accept a reality that feels fundamentally wrong based on decades of life experience. Here's something that'll make you question everything you think you know about individual consciousness, shared experiences, and the possibility that human minds can somehow sync up in ways that science still can't explain. In 1723, the merchant vessel Poseidon completed what should have been a routine trading voyage to the Caribbean routine in the sense that nobody died. The cargo arrived intact, and they made enough profit to keep everyone happy. The Poseidon wasn't one of those grand naval vessels you see in paintings, with dozens of cannons and crews of hundreds. This was a working ship, a three-masted merchant vessel that carried sugar, tobacco, rum, and whatever else could turn a profit between the Caribbean islands and European ports. The kind of ship that formed the backbone of 18th century maritime commerce, crewed by men who saw sailing as a job rather than an adventure. The crew of 18 men had worked together for over 2 years, which was actually unusual in that era. Most merchant crews were constantly changing as men jumped ship in different ports, got pressed into naval service, died from diseases, or simply found better opportunities elsewhere. But Captain Morrison had managed to keep his core crew together through a combination of fair treatment, decent pay, and the kind of mutual respect that develops when people successfully face death together multiple times. These weren't romantic figures from maritime novels. They were working-class men doing dangerous work for modest wages. Thomas Woolrich, the boatswain, had been at sea for 15 years and had 3 children he was trying to support back in Dover. Samuel Hartwell, the ship's carpenter, was saving money to buy his own workshop and retire from maritime life entirely. James Fletcher, the cook, had lost 2 fingers in a rigging accident but stayed at sea because it was the only work he knew well enough to support his aging parents. They developed the kind of brotherhood that comes from sharing small spaces, dangerous work, and the constant awareness that your survival depends entirely on your crewmates' competence and courage. They knew each other's habits, fears, strengths, and weaknesses with the intimacy that most people only share with family members. When Samuel coughed in a particular way, Thomas knew he was homesick for his wife. When James started humming specific songs, everyone knew rough. Weather was coming because the cook had an uncanny ability to sense atmospheric pressure changes. After completing their Caribbean voyage in the summer of 1723, the Poseidon docked in London where the crew was paid and officially dismissed until the next voyage. This was standard practice. Captains would hire crews for specific voyages rather than maintaining permanent employees, partly to save money and partly because the mortality rate in maritime work made long-term employment contracts impractical. The 18 crew members scattered across England to return to their families, enjoy their shore leave, and spend their wages before signing up for the next voyage. They had no way to communicate with each other once they left London. This was 1723. No postal system for working-class men, no telegraph, no phones, no social media to stay in touch. When sailors left the port, they effectively disappeared from each other's lives until they happened to meet again in some future harbor. Thomas Woolrich traveled to Dover to spend time with his wife and children. Samuel Hartwell went to Bristol where his sister lived. James Fletcher returned to his family in Portsmouth. The other 15 crew members dispersed to villages and towns across southern England, some as far as 200 miles apart. Under normal circumstances, they would have had no contact with each other until they happened to work on the same ship again, which might be months or even years in the future. But starting exactly 1 week after their dismissal, something absolutely unprecedented began happening. Not 1, not 2, but 14 of the 18 former crew members started having the exact same drowning nightmare on the same nights. At the same times, with identical details they couldn't possibly have coordinated. Think about this logically for a moment. These men had scattered across England with no means of communication. They were staying in different towns, sleeping in different beds, living with different families, eating different food, and following different daily routines. There was no plausible way they could have influenced each other's dreams or coordinated their nightmare experiences. Yet somehow, they were sharing a collective dream experience that defied every understanding of how individual consciousness works. The dream was always exactly the same, down to the smallest details. It would begin around 2 a.m., not approximately 2 a.m., but precisely at 2 a.m. according to church bells and other timekeeping methods available in 1723. The dreaming crew member would find himself lying in his familiar bed, in his familiar room, but something would feel wrong in a way he couldn't initially identify. Then would come the first sign that reality was shifting, the sensation of their beds beginning to rock gently, like a ship at anchor in calm water. Not violent motion, not the kind of rolling that comes from rough seas, but the subtle, rhythmic movement that experienced sailors recognize as the natural motion of a vessel floating on peaceful water. As the dream progressed, the rocking would intensify, and they would begin hearing the familiar sounds of shipboard life. Ropes creaking under tension, wooden beams groaning as the ship flexed with wave action, the distant sound of water lapping against the hull. These weren't generic ship sounds. These were the specific acoustic signatures of the Poseidon, sounds that each crew member had heard thousands of times during their 2 years sailing together. Their bedrooms would slowly begin transforming into the ship's interior, but not all at once. First, the smell would change. The landlocked odors of their family homes would fade, replaced by the distinctive maritime combination of tar, rope, salt spray, and the particular mustiness that develops in the lower decks of wooden ships. Then their beds would start feeling different, less like soft mattresses and more like the hammocks or hard bunks they'd slept in during their voyages. The walls of their bedrooms would seem to curve inward slightly, taking on the shape of a ship's hull. Their personal belongings, clothes, books, family photos would fade away, replaced by the familiar equipment of maritime life. Ropes, pulleys, barrels, and canvas sails would materialize in the space, creating an environment that was simultaneously their family bedroom and the interior of the Poseidon. But here's where the shared dream became truly disturbing. Instead of being surrounded by their familiar crewmates, they would see their sleeping families drowning in churning seawater that was somehow flooding through their bedrooms. Their wives, children, parents, and siblings would be struggling in impossible waters while the dreaming sailor remained powerless to save them. Thomas Woolrick would watch his 3 children, ages 6, 8, and 11, flailing desperately in seawater that was pouring through the windows of his Dover cottage. He could hear them calling for help in voices that were simultaneously their normal children's voices and the distorted sounds that voices make underwater. His wife would be reaching toward him across impossible distances, her familiar face contorted with panic as waves pulled her further away from his desperately grasping hands. Samuel Hartwell would see his elderly sister, who had never been on a ship in her life, struggling against ocean currents in what should have been her peaceful Bristol parlor. The furniture would be floating and spinning in the churning water, chairs, tables, her precious china cabinet, all transformed into maritime debris while she fought to stay afloat in an environment that made no logical sense. What made this situation absolutely extraordinary was the precision with which these shared dreams occurred across distances that should have made coordination impossible. Thomas Woolrick, living in Dover, kept a detailed journal of his nightmares because the experience was so disturbing and unusual. Samuel Hartwell, 200 miles away in Bristol, also began documenting his dreams because they felt more real than his waking life. When these journals were later compared by a researcher interested in maritime psychology, they revealed that the men had experienced identical dream sequences on the same nights, often within the same hour. Not similar dreams, not dreams with related themes, exactly the same dreams with matching details, dialogue, and even specific visual elements that appeared in the same sequence. On the night of August 15, 1723, both Thomas and Samuel recorded dreams where they watched their families drowning while a specific piece of maritime equipment, a broken yard arm from the Poseidon's mainmast, floated past their bedroom windows. Neither man had any way of knowing that the other had dreamed about this particular piece of ship equipment, yet both recorded its appearance in their dream journals with identical descriptions. On August 22nd, both men dreamed about trying to save their drowning families using a rope that kept getting longer every time they threw it, but never long enough to reach the people they were trying to rescue. Both described the rope as having exactly 37 knots of detail, so specific and unusual that its appearance in both dreams seems impossible to explain as coincidence. The shared nightmare always followed the same structural progression, regardless of which crew member was experiencing it. First came the transformation of bedroom into ship interior, then the appearance of impossible seawater flooding through domestic spaces. Next, the sight of family members drowning in waters that shouldn't exist. Finally, The dreaming sailor's desperate but futile attempts to save his loved ones, using maritime equipment that appeared and disappeared according to dream logic rather than physical reality. But here's the detail that makes this story absolutely chilling. While the crew members would dream about drowning in seawater alongside their families, in reality their families would wake up dry and confused to find their sailor relatives soaking wet, gasping and screaming about being underwater. Thomas Woolrich's wife would wake up in a perfectly dry bed to find her husband drenched in what smelled like genuine seawater, thrashing and calling out warnings about drowning that made no sense in their landlocked cottage. She would have to physically shake him awake, and he would spend several minutes coughing up what appeared to be salt water before he could speak coherently. Samuel Hartwell's sister experienced similar incidents, finding her brother saturated with brine in her Bristol guest room while she remained completely dry in her own bed just down the hallway. The seawater wasn't just moisture from perspiration, it was genuine ocean water that left salt crystals on the sheets and had the distinctive smell of deep maritime waters. What made the situation even more psychologically disturbing for the affected crew members was their complete inability to save their families in the dreams. These were men who had successfully navigated dangerous waters, survived storms, and rescued each other from various maritime emergencies. They were competent, experienced sailors who were accustomed to solving problems and protecting people under difficult conditions. But in their shared nightmares, all their maritime skills were useless. They would try to throw ropes to their drowning family members, but the ropes would dissolve in their hands. They would attempt to swim to their rescue, but the water would become thick and resistant, making movement impossible. They would call out navigation instructions and emergency procedures that had saved lives during real maritime disasters, but their families couldn't hear them over the sound of impossible waves in domestic spaces. The psychological impact of these shared nightmares was devastating for men who had prided themselves on their competence and their ability to protect others. They were experiencing repeated failures to save the people they cared about most, using skills that had previously been their source of confidence and professional identity. After 6 months of these nightly shared disasters, 12 of the 14 affected crew members made the same decision independently, without consulting each other or even knowing that their former shipmates were experiencing similar nightmares. They returned to maritime work, signing up for new voyages with whatever captains would hire experienced sailors. Within weeks of rejoining ship crews and sleeping in maritime environments again, their drowning dreams stopped completely. Not gradually, not with decreasing intensity, they simply ended. Abruptly, once the men were back in oceanic environments where their subconscious minds apparently belonged. The two men who didn't return to sailing both died within the year under circumstances that their families found inexplicable. Robert Morrison, the former second mate, died from what his doctor described as pneumonia consistent with prolonged saltwater inhalation, despite never having been near the ocean since leaving the Poseidon. His lungs were found to contain seawater and microscopic marine organisms that couldn't have survived in a landlocked environment. William Hayes, who had been the ship's lookout, was found dead in his bed under circumstances that his family described as drowning in his sleep, despite being discovered in a completely dry room with no water source nearby. The local constable noted that Hayes appeared to have died from drowning, but there was no explanation for how someone could drown while sleeping in a dry bed in a house that had no plumbing or significant water storage. Sometimes the sea doesn't just get in your blood, it gets in your dreams and refuses to let you leave. The Poseidon crew's shared nightmare experience suggests that some groups of people can develop collective psychological connections that transcend individual consciousness and operate according to principles that science still can't explain. Admiral James Richardson was what you'd call maritime royalty, a man who'd commanded ships in battles that literally shaped the fate of nations and had survived more naval engagements than most people survive awkward dinner conversations. We're talking about someone who had fought alongside Nelson, commanded fleets that decided the outcomes of wars, and possessed the kind of tactical brilliance that naval historians still study today. By 1805, Richardson was 67 years old, and finally ready to enjoy retirement at his magnificent estate and the Cotswolds' rolling green hills. Sheep dotting pastoral landscapes, and about as far from the ocean as you can get in England without actually leaving the island. He'd earned every comfort his retirement could provide through 4 decades of service that had taken him from the Caribbean to the Baltic, from the Mediterranean to the treacherous waters around Cape Horn. This wasn't some minor naval officer looking forward to a quiet pension. Richardson owned an estate that sprawled across 800 acres of prime English countryside, complete with tenant farms, a private lake, stables full of thoroughbred horses, and a library that contained the largest private collection of maritime literature in England. He had servants, groundskeepers, and enough wealth to live comfortably for several lifetimes without ever needing to smell salt air again. His wife Catherine had been dreaming of this retirement for decades, planning the gardens they would tend together, the books they would read in peaceful evenings by the fireplace, and the grandchildren who would visit during summers when the estate was at its most beautiful. After 40 years of marriage to a man who was absent for months or years at a time, fighting in wars that could have made her a widow at any moment, she was finally going to have her husband home permanently. Richardson's naval record was the stuff of legends. He'd commanded the HMS Indomitable during the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, where his tactical innovations had helped secure British naval supremacy. He'd fought in the Caribbean against French privateers, protecting merchant vessels that carried the wealth of empire. He'd survived the siege of Gibraltar, where his ship had held position under continuous artillery bombardment for 3 months. He'd been wounded 7 times, had commanded over 3,000 men during his career, and had never lost a ship under his command to enemy action. But retirement, as it turned out, came with some very specific terms and conditions that nobody had mentioned in the official paperwork, and Richardson's subconscious had some very definite opinions about his decision to leave maritime life behind. Starting exactly 3 days after he'd officially left, naval service, 3 days after signing the documents that ended his commission and transferred his final command to a younger officer, Richardson began having extraordinarily detailed drowning dreams that weren't just nightmares. These were like watching documentary films of his own future death, complete with dialogue, specific weather conditions, exact time references, and even conversations with people he hadn't met yet. In these dreams, Richardson would find himself aboard a ship he'd never seen before, but which felt simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. The vessel was sleek and modern in ways that seemed impossible for 1805 technology, longer and more streamlined than any ship currently in the Royal Navy, with unusual proportions that suggested engineering principles he couldn't identify. The dream would always begin with Richardson standing on the deck during a beautiful, calm day with perfect sailing weather. Gentle breeze, clear skies, moderate seas, the kind of conditions that experienced naval officers dream about because everything is manageable and peaceful. He would be wearing his dress uniform, which seemed odd since this was clearly a working vessel rather than a ceremonial occasion, but dream logic doesn't always follow waking protocols. But here's what made Richardson's dreams absolutely extraordinary and genuinely disturbing. They included incredibly detailed information about maritime technology that wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. He dreamed about ships with iron hulls that gleamed like mirrors in the sunlight, propulsion systems that used steam engines instead of wind power, and navigation equipment that could determine a ship's position with mathematical precision rather than relying on celestial observations in dead reckoning. Richardson's dream diary, which still exists in the British Naval Museum and makes for absolutely fascinating reading, contains descriptions that match steamship technology with remarkable accuracy. He wrote about engines that push water instead of depending on wind to push sails, and metal sides that ring like bells when struck but are stronger than the finest oak. He described smokestacks, paddle wheels, and steam-powered winches with the precision of someone who had observed these technologies in operation. But the technological anachronisms were just the beginning of what made these dreams genuinely prophetic rather than just unusually vivid. Richardson's drowning dreams were incredibly specific about when and how they would come true, providing details that read like a schedule for his own death written 17 years in advance. He dreamed that he would die by drowning exactly 17 years after his retirement, which would place his death in 1822. The dream specified that he would die on a ship whose name began with the letter M, during a voyage that he would undertake for family duty rather than adventure. He saw himself drowning not in battle or during a storm, but during what appeared to be routine sailing conditions that would suddenly turn deadly for reasons he couldn't prevent or control. More disturbingly, Richardson's dreams included specific details about the circumstances that would force him to undertake this fatal voyage. He dreamed about receiving urgent correspondence about a family member, someone close enough to compel him to travel despite his fear, but not close enough to make the journey seem worth the risk. He saw himself standing in his estate library, holding a letter that contained news serious enough to overcome his growing terror of returning to sea. The dreams also included precise information about the other passengers who would be aboard his final voyage, people he'd never met, but whose faces became as familiar to him as his own family members. He dreamed about conversations with a wine merchant from London who would be traveling on business, a young couple heading to Gibraltar for their honeymoon, and an elderly woman visiting her son who was stationed with the garrison there. These weren't vague premonitions or symbolic dreams. These were detailed scenarios with specific dialogue, exact weather conditions, and precise timing that felt more like memories than predictions. Richardson could describe the exact words the ship's captain would speak when giving sailing orders, the specific appearance of the coastline they would pass, and even the particular meals that would be served in the ship's dining cabin. For 17 years, Richardson lived with this knowledge hanging over him like a maritime sword of Damocles. He avoided ships completely, wouldn't even take ferry rides across rivers, and became genuinely phobic about any form of water transportation. His family thought he'd developed some kind of late-life anxiety disorder, but Richardson knew something they didn't. He was living on borrowed time, waiting for a specific death that his dreams had already shown him in documentary detail. The psychological impact of this situation was devastating for a man who had built his entire identity around naval courage and maritime competence. Richardson had faced enemy fire, commanded men in life-or-death situations, and made split-second decisions that affected the outcomes of major military engagements. But the prospect of his predetermined drowning death filled him with a terror that was more intense than anything he'd experienced during actual combat. His wife Catherine watched her husband gradually transform from a confident naval hero into an anxious recluse who would pace their estate library for hours, checking and rechecking maritime almanacs, weather reports, and shipping schedules as if he were trying to calculate a way to avoid his prophetic fate. Richardson became obsessed with the details of his death dreams, documenting every variation and analyzing every element as if he could somehow find a tactical solution to a predetermined destiny. The estate staff noticed that Admiral Richardson had developed strange habits that seemed connected to his maritime anxiety. He would spend hours staring at their ornamental lake, not with the peaceful contemplation of a man enjoying his retirement, but with the intense concentration of someone studying an enemy that might attack at any moment. He installed weather monitoring equipment on the estate grounds and kept detailed records of atmospheric conditions, as if tracking patterns that might help him predict when his fatal voyage would become necessary. Richardson also began corresponding with active naval officers, ostensibly to stay current with maritime developments, but actually to monitor shipping schedules and identify which vessels had names beginning with M. He maintained detailed records of merchant ships, passenger vessels, and naval craft, creating what amounted to a database of potential death traps that he might someday be compelled to board. In 1822, exactly 17 years after his retirement, precisely as his dreams had predicted, Richardson received urgent correspondence that would force him to make the decision he'd been dreading for nearly 2 decades. The letter informed him that his eldest son, Captain William Richardson, had been seriously injured in a maritime accident near Gibraltar and was requesting his father's immediate presence for what might be their final meeting. The psychological torture of this situation was exquisite in its cruelty. Richardson's son was not only his heir and favorite child, but also the naval officer who had followed most closely in his father's professional footsteps. William had served with distinction in several campaigns and was considered one of the most promising young officers in the Mediterranean fleet. The idea of his son dying alone, calling for his father while Richardson remained safely on land out of his own cowardice, was unbearable. Despite his family's desperate protests and his own overwhelming terror, Richardson felt compelled by duty, love, and honor to book passage on the next available ship to Gibraltar. The vessel that could provide the fastest passage was the merchant ship Meridian, a name that began with M, exactly as his dreams had predicted 17 years earlier. Richardson spent his final week on the estate putting his affairs in order with the methodical precision of someone who knows exactly when and how they will die. He wrote letters to be delivered after his death, updated his will with specific provisions for family members and estate staff, and spent long hours with Catherine, having conversations that felt like extended goodbyes even though he didn't explicitly tell her about his prophetic dreams. The night before his departure, Richardson walked through every room of their estate, touching familiar objects and memorizing details as if he were creating a mental inventory of the life he was about to leave behind. Catherine found him in his library just before dawn, standing among the maritime books and charts that had been his passion, looking like a condemned man preparing for execution. The Meridian departed Portsmouth on schedule with Richardson aboard, along with 47 other passengers and crew members. The passenger manifest included exactly the people Richardson had been dreaming about for 17 years, the wine merchant traveling on business, the young honeymoon couple, and the elderly woman visiting her son at Gibraltar. Even their conversations during the voyage matched the dialogue he had heard in his prophetic dreams. 3 days into the journey, during perfect weather conditions exactly as Richardson had foreseen, the Meridian began taking on water from a source that the crew couldn't identify, repair, or even locate with certainty. The ship's hull had developed what appeared to be a structural failure that caused flooding faster than the pumps could handle. But the damage was in an area that should have been impossible to breach under the calm conditions they were experiencing. According to the 7 survivors who were rescued by a passing vessel, Admiral Richardson remained eerily calm as the Meridian began its final descent beneath the waves. While other passengers panicked and crew members ran frantically trying to save the ship, Richardson helped organize the evacuation with the efficiency and composure of someone who had rehearsed these exact movements many times before. He assisted other passengers into the limited lifeboat space available, giving clear, calm orders that helped ensure the maximum number of people could be saved. When there was no more room in the boats and it became clear that some people would have to go down with the ship, Richardson accepted his fate with the dignity of a naval officer, who had always understood that the sea might claim him eventually. According to witness accounts, when the other survivors asked Richardson why he wasn't trying harder to save himself, he replied, "I've been drowning in these waters for 17 years, gentlemen. Tonight I finally get to stop." Then he put on his full-dress naval uniform, which he had inexplicably packed for what should have been a simple civilian voyage, and prepared to meet his death as a British admiral should. The survivors reported that Richardson went down with the ship standing at attention on the deck, saluting the survivors as the water closed over his head. His final words were reportedly, "Give my love to Catherine and tell her the dreams have finally stopped." What makes this story absolutely haunting from a historical perspective is that Richardson's dream journals, discovered and studied after his death, contain not just accurate predictions of his own drowning, but detailed descriptions of maritime technology and shipbuilding, techniques that wouldn't be developed until the 1840s and 1850s. His writings described steam-powered vessels, iron hull construction, screw propellers, and maritime safety equipment with technical accuracy that exceeded anything available to naval experts of his era. It was as if his dreams had been accessing maritime knowledge from decades in the future, preparing him for death in a world that he couldn't have imagined while awake. The Richardson case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of prophetic dreaming in naval history, raising profound questions about the relationship between consciousness, time, and predetermined fate. Sometimes prophetic dreams aren't warnings meant to help you avoid destiny sometimes. They're 17-year preparation courses for an inevitable future that cannot be escaped, no matter how much knowledge, wealth, or military expertise you possess. Jonas Blackwood was what you'd call a working sailor, not an officer commanding fleets or an explorer charting unknown territories. Just a guy who spent his life moving cargo from port to port across the Atlantic. He was the backbone of 17th century maritime commerce, one of thousands of men who made their living hauling sugar, tobacco, rum, indigo, and whatever else could turn a profit between the Caribbean islands, the American colonies, and European ports. For 23 years, Blackwood had been doing this work with the methodical precision of someone whose life depended on understanding every detail of oceanic geography. This wasn't romantic adventure. This was dangerous, backbreaking labor that required intimate knowledge of currents, weather patterns, seasonal winds, and the thousands of ways that the ocean could kill you if you made even small mistakes. Blackwood knew the Atlantic like most people know their own neighborhoods. He could identify his location by the color and temperature of the water, predict weather changes by subtle shifts in wave patterns, and navigate safely through treacherous areas using landmarks, depth soundings, and the accumulated wisdom that comes from having your survival depend on geographical accuracy for over 2 decades. He knew that the Gulf Stream runs northward, along the American coast at specific speeds and temperatures that change with the seasons. He understood how the trade winds shift throughout the year, creating sailing conditions that experienced mariners can exploit to reduce voyage times and avoid dangerous weather. He could identify the specific characteristics of different oceanic regions. The way Caribbean water looks different from North Atlantic water, how Mediterranean currents behave differently from Baltic currents, and why certain areas are more likely to produce the kinds of storms that can destroy ships and kill crews. This knowledge wasn't academic, it was practical, life-saving information that Blackwood had acquired through experience that nearly killed him multiple times. He'd survived 2 hurricanes, 3 incidents where his ship had run aground on unmarked reefs, and countless smaller emergencies that required quick thinking and precise understanding of maritime geography to resolve successfully. By 1678, Blackwood had saved enough money from his cargo hauling work to retire to a small cottage in rural Yorkshire, about as far from salt water as you can get in England. The nearest significant body of water was a creek that you could jump across without much effort, and the landscape was dominated by sheep farms, stone walls, and the kind of pastoral tranquility that represents everything the ocean is not: stable, predictable, and safe. Blackwood had chosen this specific location deliberately, seeking the psychological opposite of his maritime working life. No rolling motion, no salt spray, no constant awareness that death lurked just beneath the surface of beautiful but treacherous waters. He wanted to spend his retirement years sleeping in a bed that didn't move, eating meals that didn't depend on favorable winds, and waking up each morning without having to check weather conditions that could determine whether he lived through the day. His cottage was everything a retired sailor could want: solid stone, construction that would never roll or pitch in any weather, a fireplace that provided consistent warmth without depending on wind direction or fuel supplies that might run out during storms, and windows that looked out onto green fields where the most dangerous wildlife was sheep that might occasionally get grumpy about territorial disputes. But when Blackwood retired to this landlocked paradise, his relationship with maritime geography took a turn toward the absolutely impossible, creating dream experiences that violated every law of physical geography and navigational science that he'd learned during 2 decades at sea. Every night, without exception, Blackwood would dream that he was drowning in waters that couldn't possibly exist, according to any known principles of oceanic geography, meteorology, or basic physics. These weren't just unusual dreams. These were impossible dreams that featured oceanic environments that defied everything he understood about how water, weather, and maritime conditions actually work in the real world. In one recurring nightmare that appeared several times each week, Blackwood would find himself drowning in an ocean that was simultaneously the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, 2 bodies of water that are connected but have completely different characteristics in terms of salinity, temperature, current patterns, and marine life. In his dream, he could see the Rock of Gibraltar and the Azores Islands in the same visual field, even though these landmarks are separated by over 1,000 miles and could never be visible from the same location. The water in this impossible dream ocean would have the specific temperature and mineral content of the North Atlantic in winter cold enough to kill you from hypothermia in minutes, with the particular density and taste that Blackwood, recognized from years of sailing those waters during the dangerous season when ice formations and severe storms made navigation potentially fatal. But simultaneously, this freezing North Atlantic water would be filled with tropical fish that only existed in Caribbean waters, colorful species that require warm temperatures to survive and couldn't possibly live in the cold Atlantic conditions he was experiencing. Another recurring nightmare involved drowning in an ocean that somehow flowed upward instead of following normal gravitational patterns. Blackwood would feel himself sinking deeper and deeper into increasingly dark water, but somehow he would be moving upward through the water column at the same time, watching the surface get farther away even as he fell toward it in what felt like reverse gravity. The sensation was so disorienting that he would wake up with vertigo that lasted for hours, feeling like the solid floor of his cottage was somehow moving in directions that defied physics. His inner ear, which had adapted to oceanic motion over 23 years of sailing, couldn't make sense of dream experiences that violated basic principles of up and down, creating physical symptoms that persisted into his waking life. But the most disturbing and psychologically complex dream involved drowning in an ocean that was composed entirely of water from every place he'd ever sailed, somehow mixed together in proportions that should have been impossible to achieve or maintain. In this nightmare, Blackwood could identify, by taste and temperature, water from the Mediterranean mixing with water from the Caribbean, which was simultaneously water from the North Sea, the Baltic, and the tropical waters around various Atlantic islands. His maritime experience allowed him to recognize the distinctive characteristics of different oceanic regions with the precision of a wine expert identifying vintages. Mediterranean water has a particular salinity and mineral content that's different from Atlantic water. Caribbean water has specific temperature and clarity characteristics that distinguish it from northern waters. Baltic water has unique chemical properties that reflect the geological features of that region. In his dream, all these different water types would be swirling together in combinations that violated basic principles of oceanography, creating a maritime greatest hits compilation where every drop of seawater that had ever tried to kill him was somehow present simultaneously. He would be drowning in impossible water that contained the concentrated essence of his entire sailing career, experiencing every dangerous oceanic environment he'd ever encountered at the same time. The psychological impact of these geographically impossible dreams was devastating for someone whose professional competence had been built on precise understanding of maritime geography. Blackwood's survival at sea had depended on his ability to identify where he was, predict what conditions he would encounter, and navigate safely through environments that followed predictable natural laws. But his dreams were showing him oceanic environments that made no geographical sense, creating a psychological crisis for someone whose entire identity was based on understanding how water, weather, and navigation actually work in the real world. It was like being a master chef who suddenly couldn't identify familiar ingredients, or a musician who could no longer recognize notes. The fundamental knowledge that defined his expertise was being contradicted by his own subconscious. Blackwood's wife Martha started, finding physical evidence that these weren't just unusually vivid dreams, but somehow involved real interactions with impossible maritime environments. She would discover sand in their bed that didn't match any local geological formations. Tropical sand with coral fragments from Caribbean beaches, volcanic sand from Atlantic islands, even sand that contained microscopic shells from deep ocean environments that Blackwood had sailed over but never seen up close. The sand wasn't just random debris that could have been tracked in from outside. Martha would find specific types of sand that corresponded to particular locations from Blackwood's sailing career: fine white sand from Barbados beaches where he'd loaded sugar cargo, black volcanic sand from the Azores where he'd taken on fresh water during Atlantic crossings, and coarse gray sand from North Sea coastal areas where he'd delivered goods to Baltic ports. More mysteriously, their cottage bedroom would sometimes smell like specific harbors from Blackwood's maritime career, filling with scents that were so distinctive and location-specific that there was no possibility of mistaking them for local Yorkshire odors. One morning, Martha would wake up to find their room smelling exactly like the port of Santo Domingo, a complex combination of tropical spices, tar from ship maintenance, exotic flowers from the Caribbean landscape, and the particular mustiness that develops in tropical harbors where high humidity mixes with maritime commerce. Another morning, their bedroom would smell like London's Thames, a distinctive combination of river mud, coal smoke from industrial activities, sewage from urban runoff, and the specific maritime odors that develop where fresh river water meets saltwater tides. This scent was absolutely unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in London's port areas, but their cottage was 200 miles from London and had no conceivable source for these urban maritime odors. The local physician, Dr. Whitmore, was completely baffled when Martha brought him in to examine her husband's condition. Dr. Whitmore had some experience treating sailors. Yorkshire wasn't a maritime county, but traveling physicians occasionally encountered retired mariners who had health problems related to their seafaring careers. But Blackwood's symptoms were unlike anything Dr. Whitmore had encountered in his medical practice. Physical examination revealed traces of salt in Blackwood's lungs that were consistent with saltwater inhalation, even though the man hadn't been near the ocean in over a year and lived in one of the most landlocked areas of England. More puzzling, the salt deposits in Blackwood's respiratory system weren't just generic salt. They contained mineral traces that suggested exposure to specific oceanic environments. Dr. Whitmore's chemical analysis, using the limited laboratory techniques available in 1678, indicated that Blackwood's lungs contained salt deposits from multiple different oceanic regions, as if he were somehow breathing different types of seawater simultaneously. Dr. Whitmore's medical notes, which survive in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians, describe Blackwood's condition as respiratory anomaly consistent with maritime exposure in a patient with no recent oceanic contact. The physician was particularly puzzled by evidence that Blackwood was somehow experiencing multiple different oceanic environments simultaneously, creating physiological symptoms that should have been impossible in a landlocked cottage. The psychological impact of these impossible geographical dreams was gradually destroying Blackwood's mental health and his relationship with his wife. He would wake up each morning feeling like he'd spent the night drowning in every dangerous water he'd ever encountered during his sailing career, creating cumulative trauma that was more intense than anything he'd experienced during actual maritime emergencies. Martha documented the progression of her husband's condition in letters to her sister, noting that Blackwood was becoming increasingly obsessed with maritime geography and navigation, even though he was trying to retire from that life. He would spend hours drawing detailed charts of impossible oceanic environments, trying to map the geographical anomalies he was experiencing in his dreams. These charts, which still exist in private collections, show oceanic regions that could never exist in reality. Areas where different seas and oceans are somehow adjacent to each other despite being separated by thousands of miles. Current patterns that flow in directions that would violate basic physics, and island chains that combine features from multiple different geographical regions. The drawings demonstrate both Blackwood's exceptional knowledge of real maritime geography and his growing psychological disconnection from geographical reality. He was creating maps of dream worlds with the precision of an experienced navigator, but the worlds he was mapping were impossible combinations of real places that couldn't coexist in any actual oceanic environment. After 2 years of these geographically impossible drowning dreams, Blackwood made a decision that probably saved his sanity, but definitely shortened his life. He took all his retirement savings and moved back to the coast, purchasing a small house in a port town where he could at least see and smell the ocean from his bedroom window. The change in location didn't stop the drowning dreams, but it made them geographically consistent for the first time since his retirement. Instead of drowning in impossible combinations of different oceanic environments, Blackwood began dreaming about drowning in water that actually existed in locations that made geographical sense, still terrifying, but at least following the natural laws he understood from his sailing career. The psychological relief of returning to geographically possible drowning dreams allowed Blackwood to sleep more peacefully, even though he was still experiencing nightly maritime nightmares. His dreams were still disturbing, but they no longer violated his fundamental understanding of how oceanic geography works, reducing the cognitive dissonance that had been destroying his mental health during his inland retirement. However, the physical toll of 2 years of impossible geographical dreams had already damaged Blackwood's health in ways that returning to the coast couldn't reverse. He lived only 3 more years after moving back to maritime environments, and his neighbors reported that he spent his final months sitting by his window, staring at the harbor as if he were trying to memorize every detail of real oceanic geography. When local fishermen found Blackwood dead in his bed in 1681, his room was filled with the scent of every ocean he'd ever sailed. But instead of the confusing mixture of impossible waters from his inland dreams, the scents were now organized in geographical order: Mediterranean, Atlantic, Caribbean, North Sea, as if his final dreams had been a systematic tour through all the real maritime environments that had defined his working life. The fishermen also reported that Blackwood appeared to have died peacefully, with a slight smile on his face, as if he had finally resolved whatever geographical conflicts had been tormenting his dreams for years. His final charts, found beside his bed, showed accurately mapped oceanic regions with proper geographical relationships. No more impossible combinations of distant waters. No more violations of natural law. Jonas Blackwood's story suggests that some people's minds become so thoroughly saturated with specific geographical knowledge that even retirement can't wash away the accumulated understanding of oceanic environments. His dreams seem to represent his subconscious mind's struggle to process and organize decades of maritime geographical experience, creating impossible combinations until he returned to environments where his expertise could function according to familiar natural laws. It makes you wonder if geographical knowledge becomes so deeply embedded in some people's consciousness that it continues operating even when they try to leave those environments behind, and whether the mind can be literally poisoned by impossible combinations of real experiences that violate the natural organizing principles that make expertise possible in the first place. Samuel Morgan had what you might call the worst possible job for someone who would later develop a pathological fear of drowning. He was a deep-sea salvage diver in an era when this profession had roughly the same life expectancy as volunteering to be shot out of cannons for entertainment. In the 1830s, deep-sea diving meant descending to shipwrecks in primitive equipment that was essentially a leather suit connected to an air hose, with survival rates that would make modern insurance companies refuse to write policies. The technology was terrifyingly simple and horrifyingly unreliable. Morgan would climb into what was called an atmospheric diving suit, a leather contraption that looked like medieval armor designed by someone who had never seen actual armor but had heard vague descriptions from a drunk person. The suit was connected to the surface by a single air hose that provided his only link to survival, pumped by hand-operated bellows that depended entirely on the competence and attention of his surface crew. If the air hose got tangled, cut, or disconnected, Morgan would die. If the leather suit developed even a small leak at depth, the water pressure would kill him instantly. If his surface crew got distracted, drunk, or simply made mistakes with the hand pumps, he would suffocate underwater while trying to recover cargo from ships that had already killed their entire crews. The fact that Morgan had survived 8 years in this profession was statistically miraculous. Most deep-sea salvage divers died on their first or second dive, crushed by water pressure, suffocated by equipment failures, or simply lost when their air hoses snapped and their bodies sank to depths where recovery was impossible. But Morgan had somehow beaten those lethal odds through a combination of exceptional skill, obsessive attention to safety procedures, and the kind of luck that makes you wonder if some people have supernatural protection. He'd recovered cargo from dozens of shipwrecks in waters so deep that most of his colleagues died just attempting to reach the wreckage. He'd worked in the North Sea, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean, descending to depths where the water pressure would crush a human body like stepping on an insect. The work paid extraordinarily well precisely because it was so dangerous, Salvage companies would pay almost any price for someone competent enough to survive multiple deep water recoveries. Morgan had saved enough money by 1834 to retire comfortably, purchase a house in the Scottish Highlands, and never need to risk his life underwater again. He was 34 years old, which made him practically ancient in a profession where most practitioners died in their 20s. His retirement was involuntary, triggered by a diving accident that nearly killed him and left him with permanent lung damage that made deep water work impossible. During what should have been a routine cargo recovery from a merchant vessel that had sunk in 200 feet of water, Morgan's air hose had become entangled in the wreckage, cutting off his oxygen supply while he was trapped at a depth where the water pressure would kill him in seconds if his suit failed. He'd spent 20 minutes underwater with no air supply, using emergency techniques and pure determination to free himself and ascend safely, an experience that should have been fatal, but somehow left him alive, traumatized, and permanently unable to handle the deep water pressure that his profession required. The doctor who treated him said that Morgan's lungs had been damaged in ways consistent with near drowning, but also with pressure injuries that suggested his body had been subjected to forces that should have killed him instantly. Morgan moved to the mountains of Scotland specifically to escape any reminders of his maritime career, choosing a location where the nearest large body of water was over 60 miles away and the altitude was high enough to make the air pressure completely different from sea level conditions. He thought that distance, altitude, and landlocked geography would free him from the nightmares that had begun during his final diving years and had been getting worse since his retirement. He was spectacularly wrong about the healing power of geography and altitude, because his subconscious had developed a relationship with deep water that couldn't be resolved by simply moving to mountains. Morgan's drowning dreams were unlike anything the other sailors in our stories experienced because they involved drowning in impossible depths, not just underwater, but in crushing depths that exceeded anything that existed in the real world's oceans. These weren't dreams about drowning at normal oceanic depths, where a human body could theoretically survive for a few minutes before succumbing to pressure or lack of oxygen. These were dreams about drowning in abyssal depths that would compress a human body into something the size of a marble in fractions of seconds. In his most recurring nightmare, which appeared almost every night for months after his retirement, Morgan would find himself lying in his comfortable Scottish bedroom, but somehow he was also simultaneously 3,000 feet underwater in oceanic trenches that were deeper than any waters he'd actually worked in during his salvage career. The psychological terror came from his complete professional understanding of what deep water pressure would do to his body, combined with the dream's sadistic refusal to let him die quickly the way he would in real life. Instead of being crushed instantly the way physics and human physiology would normally work, Morgan would experience slow-motion destruction in his dreams, feeling his ribcage compress gradually over what seemed like hours, his lungs collapsing cell by cell with medical precision, his eardrums rupturing with the methodical progression of an anatomy demonstration. He would remain conscious throughout this impossible gradual destruction, feeling every stage of what should have been instantaneous death. The absolute darkness of deep ocean water surrounded him in these dreams, broken only by the bioluminescent creatures that live in the ocean's deepest places, creatures that Morgan had never seen during his actual diving career, but that appeared in his dreams with scientific accuracy that wouldn't be verified until deep sea exploration technology was developed decades later. His dream journal, which he kept obsessively as a way of trying to understand and control these experiences, contains descriptions of deep sea creatures that match species that wouldn't be scientifically documented until the invention of deep-sea submarines in the 20th century. He wrote about fish with luminescent organs that create their own light in the absolute darkness of oceanic trenches, described predatory creatures with transparent bodies and impossible teeth, and documented the behavior of deep-sea organisms that scientists wouldn't observe until the 1950s. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Morgan's dreams was their inclusion of geological information about deep ocean environments that was completely unknown to 19th century marine science. He dreamed about underwater mountain ranges taller than the Alps, valleys in the ocean floor deeper than any canyon on land, and geological formations that wouldn't be mapped until modern oceanographic research developed the technology to explore these environments. His journals contain phrases like mountains underwater taller than any mountains on land, and valleys in the ocean deeper than the sky is high, language that perfectly describes oceanic trenches and underwater mountain systems that weren't scientifically documented until the mid-20th century, when deep-sea research vessels could finally explore these environments safely. Morgan would dream about lying on the bottom of oceanic trenches while somehow remaining alive and conscious, surrounded by geological formations that demonstrated the Earth's crust behaving according to principles that wouldn't be understood until the development of plate tectonics theory. He saw underwater earthquakes creating new valleys, volcanic activity forming new underwater mountains, and geological processes that were occurring at speeds and scales that exceeded anything he could have learned from the limited marine science available in his era. The physical evidence of Morgan's deep water nightmares was documented by his wife Isabella, who recorded strange phenomena that suggested these weren't just psychological experiences but somehow involved actual interactions with deep oceanic environments. She would wake up in their Scottish Highland bedroom to find the room filled with a pressure sensation so intense that her ears would pop as if she were rapidly descending in altitude, except they were sleeping in a house that was 1,500 feet above sea level, where air pressure changes shouldn't occur. Sometimes Isabella would discover that all the glass objects in their bedroom, water glasses, mirrors, window panes, had developed hairline cracks overnight, as if they'd been subjected to pressure changes that exceeded their structural capacity. The pattern of cracks was consistent with what happens to glass when it's subjected to rapid pressure increases, but there was no explanation for how such pressure changes could occur in a bedroom in the Scottish mountains. Most mysteriously and disturbingly, Morgan would sometimes wake up with symptoms of decompression sickness, the condition that divers get when they ascend too quickly from deep water, causing nitrogen bubbles to form in their blood. He would experience joint pain, difficulty breathing, disorientation, and skin rashes that were medically consistent with nitrogen narcosis, despite never having left his bed or been exposed to any conditions that could cause these symptoms. The local physician, Dr. MacLeod, documented Morgan's condition with the scientific curiosity of someone encountering a medical phenomenon that challenged everything he thought he understood about human physiology. Dr. MacLeod had some experience treating diving-related injuries. Scotland's coastal areas had commercial divers who worked in the North Sea, but Morgan's symptoms were occurring without any exposure to diving conditions. Dr. MacLeod's medical notes described finding nitrogen bubbles in Morgan's blood samples that were consistent with rapid decompression, but occurring in a patient who lived at high altitude and had no recent exposure to pressure changes. The physician was particularly puzzled by the fact that Morgan's symptoms followed the exact pattern of severe decompression sickness, including the specific timing and progression that indicated exposure to extreme depth followed by rapid ascent. After 5 years of these deep water nightmares that were gradually destroying his physical and mental health, Morgan made a decision that seemed counterintuitive but proved to be psychologically necessary. He took a job as a lighthouse keeper on a remote island off the Scottish coast. The position offered isolation, steady employment, and most importantly, a chance to be surrounded by surface water that he could see, understand, and control. The lighthouse job was perfect for someone with Morgan's maritime background and his particular psychological needs. He would be working around water again, but surface water with normal pressure, familiar conditions, and the kind of oceanic environment that he could handle professionally without triggering the deep water terror that had been haunting his dreams. The lighthouse was positioned on rocks that were surrounded by water that was deep enough to be properly oceanic, but shallow enough that Morgan could see the bottom during calm weather. Being surrounded by controllable, visible, surface-level seawater somehow satisfied Morgan's subconscious enough to stop the deep water dreams that had been terrorizing him for years. Instead of drowning in impossible abyssal depths, he began sleeping peacefully while listening to normal ocean waves and breathing salt air that smelled like familiar, maritime environments rather than the crushing darkness of oceanic trenches. But the lighthouse logbooks that survive from Morgan's tenure show an interesting pattern that suggests his deep water dreams had given him knowledge that extended beyond normal maritime experience. On nights when storms brought unusually high waves or unusual weather conditions, Morgan would record sightings of creatures from the deep places in the waters around his lighthouse, creatures that matched the detailed descriptions in his old dream journals. These weren't casual observations or folklore. Morgan's logbook entries describe specific deep sea creatures with scientific accuracy, noting their behavior, appearance, and the environmental conditions that brought them to surface waters where they could be observed from his lighthouse. His descriptions match deep sea species that wouldn't be scientifically documented until deep sea research technology was developed decades later. The lighthouse logbooks contain entries like, "Storm brought up the luminous fish with transparent flesh and teeth like glass needles," and "High seas revealed the swimming creatures with their own lights, moving in patterns that suggest intelligence." These descriptions correspond to deep sea species that require specific pressure and temperature conditions to survive, and that only appear in surface waters during unusual weather events that create temporary changes in oceanic conditions. Morgan's post-nightmare knowledge of deep-sea marine life was so accurate that his lighthouse reports were eventually used by marine biologists as historical documentation of deep-sea species behavior in Scottish coastal waters. Researchers in the 20th century would reference Morgan's observations as evidence of how extreme weather events can temporarily bring abyssal creatures to surface waters, where they can be observed by knowledgeable maritime workers. Samuel Morgan died in 1847, when his lighthouse was destroyed by a storm that local residents described as the most violent weather event in their region's recorded history. The storm brought waves that were estimated to be over 100 feet high, far exceeding anything that Scottish coastal waters normally experience, and winds that exceeded the structural capacity of buildings that had withstood centuries of harsh maritime weather. Morgan's body was never found, but local fishermen reported that the waters around his lighthouse had become unnaturally deep overnight, as if the ocean floor had simply opened up and swallowed the lighthouse, the rocks it was built on, and everything in the surrounding area. Depth soundings taken after the storm showed that the ocean floor in that location had dropped from 30 feet to over 300 feet, creating an underwater canyon where previously there had been shallow coastal waters. The fishermen also reported that the waters around the former lighthouse location had become home to deep sea creatures that had never been seen in Scottish coastal waters: luminous fish, transparent predators, and other marine life that normally exists only in the deepest oceanic environments. These creatures continued to appear in the area for years after Morgan's death, as if his destruction had somehow created a permanent connection between surface waters and the abyssal depths that had haunted his dreams. Sometimes our dreams don't just predict our future. They create the conditions for that future to manifest in ways that transform the physical world around us. Samuel Morgan's deep water nightmares may have prepared him for a death that would occur not just in deep water, but in waters that became deep specifically to accommodate the kind of ending that his subconscious had been rehearsing for years. His story suggests that prolonged exposure to extreme environments can create psychological connections that persist even after the physical exposure ends, and that these connections might sometimes be strong enough to influence the physical world in ways that bring dream scenarios into actual reality. Morgan's deep water terror became deep water fact, as if his nightmares had been instructions for how the ocean should behave when it was finally time to claim him permanently. You know what's stranger than one person having impossible drowning dreams? An entire town sharing them simultaneously, like some kind of maritime nightmare epidemic that spread through a community faster than actual plague and with symptoms that were somehow more disturbing than physical disease. In 1756, the fishing village of Seahaven on the English coast experienced what local records describe as the year when everyone drowned on dry land, a phenomenon so unusual and well documented that it became a case study for researchers trying to understand how collective psychological experiences can manifest in ways that challenge everything we think we know about individual consciousness and community mental health. Sea Haven was a typical small coastal community, about 300 residents, whose lives revolved entirely around fishing, boat maintenance, and the endless cycle of maritime commerce that connected their isolated village to the wider world. These weren't sophisticated urban people with complex psychological lives. They were working-class folks whose daily routines were determined by tides, weather, and the seasonal migration patterns of the fish that provided their only source of income. The village consisted of about 60 houses clustered around a small harbor, where fishing boats would depart before dawn and return in the evening with catches that would either feed the community or be sold to merchants who transported fish to larger markets inland. Life in Sea Haven followed patterns that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries: predictable, sustainable, and boring in the way that small maritime communities tend to be when nothing particularly interesting or terrible is happening. But over the course of 6 months in 1756, nearly every adult resident of this quiet fishing village began having identical drowning dreams on the same nights, creating a collective nightmare experience that transformed their peaceful community into something resembling a psychological disaster zone where the boundaries between sleeping and waking reality became increasingly unclear. The shared nightmare always followed exactly the same pattern, with variations so minimal that when residents compared their experiences, they realized they weren't just having similar dreams, but were somehow participating in the same dream event simultaneously. The collective dream would begin with everyone finding themselves in their familiar village, going about their normal daily activities, tending shops, maintaining boats, preparing meals, having ordinary conversations with neighbors and family members. But everything was happening 50 feet below the surface of the ocean, in a version of Sea Haven that was completely submerged but still functioning as a normal community. People would be conducting their usual business while surrounded by seawater, as if the entire village had been relocated to the ocean floor, but nobody had noticed or adjusted their behavior to account for this impossible change in their environment. Children would play in the town square while schools of fish swam overhead like flocks of birds. The blacksmith would work at his forge, which somehow continued to burn and produce heat despite being completely underwater. The baker would be making bread in ovens that functioned normally despite being surrounded by ocean water. Women would hang laundry on lines where the clothes would wave in underwater currents instead of air currents, but the domestic routines continued exactly as they would in a surface community. The most psychologically disturbing aspect of this shared underwater community dream was how normal everything felt until the moment, when everyone would simultaneously remember that humans can't breathe underwater. This realization would hit every dreaming villager at exactly the same moment, creating a collective panic that transformed their peaceful underwater community into a scene of mass drowning that felt more real than their actual waking lives. Hundreds of people would suddenly begin struggling for air that wasn't available, trying to swim to a surface that didn't exist, calling for help from neighbors who were experiencing identical suffocation. The underwater village would transform from a peaceful community into a maritime disaster where everyone was drowning together, while still trying to help each other survive an impossible situation. What made this collective drowning experience absolutely extraordinary was its precision and coordination across the entire community. People would wake up at exactly the same moment throughout the village, creating a synchronized chorus of gasping, coughing, and crying that could be heard from one end of Sea Haven to the other. Residents would wake up their neighbors by screaming, only to discover that everyone was already awake and experiencing identical symptoms of saltwater inhalation despite never having left their beds. The physical evidence of these shared underwater experiences was documented by the village physician, Dr. Morrison, who found himself treating an entire community for symptoms that should have been impossible given their sleeping locations. Nearly every adult in Sea Haven would wake up with salt deposits in their lungs, seaweed in their hair, and the distinctive smell of deep ocean water on their clothing and bedding. Dr. Morrison's medical records, which survive in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians, describe treating patients for collective maritime exposure during terrestrial sleep, a condition he'd never encountered and couldn't find described in any medical literature. The entire community was experiencing physiological symptoms consistent with prolonged submersion in seawater, but occurring simultaneously in people who had been sleeping in their own beds throughout the village. More mysteriously, the shared dreams left physical evidence throughout. Sea Haven that suggested the collective underwater experience had somehow influenced their actual environment. Villagers would wake up to find their gardens covered in seaweed that had no business being there, with species that didn't grow in their coastal waters and couldn't have been transported to their inland gardens through any natural process. Houses throughout the village would smell like ocean depths despite being located above sea level and having no source for deep maritime odors. Wells that had provided fresh water for generations would consistently taste of salt water, despite being fed by underground springs that came from inland sources. The village church would be filled with the sound of what parishioners described as underwater echoes, creating acoustic effects that suggested the building was somehow partially submerged even though it stood on the highest ground in the community. The collective drowning dreams created a psychological crisis for a community that had always prided itself on practical, down-to-earth attitudes toward life and work. These were people who dealt with real maritime dangers every day. They understood the genuine risks of fishing in dangerous waters. They'd lost friends and family members to actual drowning accidents, and they weren't prone to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs. But the shared underwater community dreams challenged their fundamental understanding of reality in ways that practical maritime experience couldn't help them process. They were experiencing something that felt more real than their waking lives, but that violated every natural law they understood about breathing, underwater survival, and the basic physics of human existence. The community's attempts to understand and cope with their collective drowning dreams reflected the practical problem-solving approach that fishing communities develop out of necessity. Village elders organized meetings where residents could compare their dream experiences and look for patterns that might explain what was happening to them. They documented the timing, duration, and specific details of their shared nightmares with the methodical precision that maritime workers apply to weather observation and fishing logistics. These community meetings revealed that the collective dreams weren't random, but followed patterns that seemed to be connected to real maritime conditions around their village. The shared drowning dreams were most intense during spring tide periods when ocean waters rose highest, and seemed to be influenced by weather patterns that affected the actual fishing conditions in their coastal waters. The psychological impact of months of shared drowning dreams began to affect the community's ability to function normally during their waking hours. Residents became afraid to go to sleep, knowing they would experience the terrifying collective drowning that left them exhausted, traumatized, and gasping for air. The entire village developed a kind of collective insomnia as people tried to avoid the shared nightmares that were making normal rest impossible. Fishing activities became increasingly difficult as the community's sleep deprivation affected their ability to handle boats safely, read weather conditions accurately, and make the split-second decisions that maritime work requires for survival. Several accidents occurred when fishermen who had been deprived of normal sleep made mistakes that put themselves and their crewmates in danger on actual ocean waters. The collective drowning dream stopped abruptly when the village priest, Father Mackenzie, organized a community exorcism that involved blessing the entire town with holy water from a source, 100 miles inland, water that had never been in contact with oceanic or maritime environments. The ceremony was conducted on a night when the entire community participated, gathering in the town square at midnight to receive blessings that were intended to free them from whatever supernatural influence was causing their shared underwater experiences. Whether this was genuine spiritual intervention, the power of collective belief and suggestion, or simply coincidental timing that corresponded with the natural end of whatever psychological or environmental factors had been causing the shared dreams, the community exorcism marked the immediate end of Sea Haven's collective drowning nightmares. The residents never experienced shared dreams again, and within weeks they had returned to normal sleep patterns and regular fishing activities. but the experience left lasting changes in the community's social structure and religious practices. The shared drowning dreams had created bonds between residents that hadn't existed before, as people who had literally experienced drowning together developed relationships that were deeper and more intimate than normal neighborly connections. Sea Haven's collective drowning experience also established it as a place of pilgrimage for researchers interested in shared psychological phenomena, community mental health, and the possibility that entire communities can sometimes access collective unconscious experiences that transcend individual awareness. The village records that survive from this period provide one of the most detailed documented cases of community-wide shared dreaming in British history. And Sea Haven's underwater village dreams continue to be studied by researchers trying to understand how collective consciousness might operate under extreme psychological conditions that affect entire communities simultaneously. Sometimes individual nightmares are just personal psychological events, but sometimes they're symptoms of collective experiences that reveal connections between human minds that science still can't fully explain or understand. Captain Marcus Thornfield had spent 20 years sailing cargo ships between European ports, moving everything from wine and silk to grain and manufactured goods through waters that connected the continent's major commercial centers. This wasn't glamorous exploration or military adventure. This was the steady, reliable work of maritime commerce that kept European economies functioning and made merchants wealthy, through the patient accumulation of modest profits on countless routine voyages. Thornfield was what you'd call a professional sailor, competent, experienced, and boring in exactly the ways that ship owners valued most highly. He didn't seek adventure or take unnecessary risks. He simply moved cargo from point A to point B as efficiently and safely as possible. Year after year, voyage after voyage, building a reputation for reliability that made him one of the most sought-after merchant captains in northern European trade routes. By 1801, at age 48, Thornfield had saved enough money to retire comfortably to a cottage in rural Devon, where he planned to tend a garden, read books about places he'd visited during his sailing career, and sleep in a bed that never moved regardless of weather conditions. He thought retirement would be peaceful, predictable, and mercifully free from the constant motion, salt spray, and occupational hazards that had defined his working life for 2 decades. He was wrong about the peaceful part and spectacularly wrong about the predictable part, because his subconscious had developed some very specific ideas about time, history, and drowning that manifested through dreams that violated not just the laws of physics, but the basic principles of linear time progression that most people take for granted. Thornfield's drowning dreams had a unique twist that distinguished them from every other maritime nightmare we've discussed. He would find himself drowning not just in impossible waters, but in impossible time periods, experiencing death by water in historical eras that he'd never lived through and that offered completely different approaches to drowning, maritime technology, and oceanic survival techniques. One night he'd be drowning in medieval waters while wearing armor that dragged him to the bottom of harbors that existed centuries before his birth. The armor would be historically accurate, not the fantasy nonsense that most people imagine when they think about medieval warfare, but the actual heavy, precisely fitted metal protection that medieval warriors wore into battle. Thornfield could feel the specific weight distribution, the way properly made armor restricts movement while providing protection, and the particular way that metal armor behaves when submerged in seawater. In these medieval drowning dreams, Thornfield would experience the specific horror of trying to swim while wearing 60 pounds of metal that was designed to keep weapons from penetrating rather than to help the wearer survive in water. He would sink like a stone, feeling the armor trap air briefly before filling with water. Experiencing the medieval approach to drowning, which involved accepting death with religious resignation rather than fighting desperately for survival the way modern people do. Another recurring time displacement dream involved drowning in what seemed like futuristic oceans, struggling in water that was somehow more dense than normal water while strange. Metal ships sailed overhead that used propulsion systems and construction techniques that wouldn't exist until centuries after Thornfield's actual lifetime. The future water would feel different, heavier, more viscous, almost like swimming through liquid that had been artificially modified to have properties that exceeded normal H2O characteristics. The futuristic drowning dreams included details about maritime technology that were completely beyond anything available in 1801, but that followed logical engineering principles that suggested genuine technological development rather than fantasy speculation. Thornfield would see ships powered by methods other than wind or muscle power, navigation equipment that could determine position without using stars or landmarks, and rescue techniques that involved mechanical devices rather than human strength and seamanship skills. What made these time displacement dreams absolutely extraordinary was their incredible historical accuracy and internal consistency. Thornfield wasn't just having random dreams that included historical elements. He was experiencing complete immersion in specific historical periods that were accurate down to details about shipbuilding techniques, navigation methods, maritime law, and even the social relationships between different types of maritime workers. In his dreams about drowning during Viking raids, Thornfield could identify exactly which historical period he was experiencing based on the style of ships around him, the design of weapons and armor, the specific techniques that Viking mariners used for navigation and ship handling, and even the social hierarchy that determined which crew members would be saved first during maritime emergencies. The Viking drowning dreams included authentic details about Norse ship construction that historians wouldn't verify until archaeological discoveries were made decades later. Thornfield would dream about drowning while trying to help repair ships that were built using specific woodworking techniques, rope and sail construction methods, and hull design principles that matched archaeological evidence of actual Viking vessels that wouldn't be discovered and studied until the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His dreams about drowning in waters around Spanish galleons during the 16th century included similarly precise historical information about maritime technology, navigation techniques, and ship design that exceeded what was available in any books or historical sources, accessible to someone living in rural Devon in 1801. Thornfield would experience drowning while surrounded by ships that were constructed using specific techniques for ocean crossing voyages, equipped with navigation instruments that were historically accurate for that period, and operated by crews whose behavior and social organization matched what modern historians know about Spanish maritime culture during the Age of Exploration. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Thornfield's time-slipping dreams was how they seemed to be teaching him comprehensive maritime history through the experience of drowning in every significant period of human oceanic development. He wasn't just observing historical maritime environments, he was participating in them as someone who understood the technology, navigation techniques, and survival strategies appropriate to each time period. After 2 years of drowning throughout history on a nightly basis, Thornfield made a decision that seemed completely insane to his neighbors, but probably saved his sanity and quite possibly extended his life. He moved to a monastery where he spent his remaining years writing what became the most comprehensive history of maritime disasters and oceanic survival techniques that had ever been compiled by a single individual. Thornfield's historical writings covered maritime events from ancient Rome through hypothetical future shipwrecks, documenting survival techniques, ship construction methods, and navigation technologies from dozens of different historical periods and technological development levels. His work included detailed information about maritime disasters that had been forgotten by contemporary historians, navigation techniques that had been lost to time, and shipbuilding methods that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern maritime. Archaeology developed the techniques to study ancient vessel construction. The manuscript that Thornfield produced during his monastery years was initially dismissed by contemporary scholars as the fantasies of a disturbed ex-sailor who had spent too many years at sea and had developed elaborate delusions about maritime history. The work was too detailed, too comprehensive, and too accurate for something that claimed to be based primarily on dream experiences, rather than scholarly research and historical documentation. But modern maritime historians recognize Thornfield's dream-based historical writings as one of the most accurate and comprehensive accounts of oceanic survival techniques and maritime technology development ever written. His descriptions of ancient Roman naval construction methods match archaeological evidence that wasn't available until underwater archaeology was developed. His accounts of medieval navigation techniques correspond to historical documents that weren't discovered until centuries after his death. His speculations about future maritime technology anticipated developments that wouldn't occur until the age of steam power and modern shipbuilding materials. Marcus Thornfield died peacefully in 1823, apparently in his sleep, with his final historical manuscript still unfinished on his writing desk. The monks found him smiling, surrounded by charts and diagrams that showed maritime technology from throughout human history, as if he had finally completed whatever temporal maritime education his dreams had been providing for over 2 decades. His time-slipping, drowning dreams suggest that some forms of historical knowledge might be accessible through dream experiences that transcend the normal limitations of individual lifetime and personal experience, allowing consciousness to access information about human development that extends far beyond what any single person could learn through conventional education or research. Now that we've explored these extraordinary individual experiences, let's step back and look at how different cultures throughout history have tried to make sense of maritime dreams, drowning visions, and the strange relationship between sailors and the waters that define their lives. And honestly, it's fascinating how every maritime culture develops sophisticated, psychological and spiritual frameworks that make a lot more sense than most modern psychology. When it comes to understanding why people who work on water continue to dream about the sea long after they've left it behind. You know, when you really dig into historical records from maritime communities around the world, you start to realize that what we've been calling unusual dream experiences were actually considered completely normal and expected by people who understood oceanic work better than we do today. These weren't anomalies or psychological disorders, they were recognized occupational hazards that came with specific treatments, preventive measures, and community support systems. The ancient Greeks had a particularly sophisticated understanding of maritime dreams that honestly makes more sense than a lot of contemporary sleep research. They didn't view the ocean as just a physical space filled with water. They understood it as a psychological realm that existed parallel to normal human consciousness with its own rules, inhabitants, and relationship to human awareness. In Greek maritime theory, when someone spent years working on the water, part of their soul would literally merge with what they called thalassic consciousness, oceanic awareness that operated according to different principles than land-based human psychology. This wasn't metaphorical or symbolic. They believed this was an actual physiological process where extended oceanic exposure would cause permanent changes in human consciousness that couldn't be reversed by simply returning to land. Greek maritime workers would undergo specific rituals before retiring from sea work, elaborate ceremonies designed to help separate their land consciousness from their sea consciousness through processes that were part spiritual intervention, part practical psychology, and part community support system. These rituals involved symbolic drowning and rebirth ceremonies, where retiring sailors would be completely submerged in special pools of inland spring water while priests chanted prayers to Poseidon, asking the sea god to release the sailor's spirit from oceanic bondage. What's remarkable is that historical records suggest the separation. Ceremonies were actually effective at reducing maritime dream experiences. Sailors who completed the full ritual process were significantly less likely to experience disturbing oceanic dreams during retirement, compared to mariners who retired without community ceremonies. Whether this was spiritual intervention, psychological suggestion, or just the benefit of community support during major life transitions. The Greek approach to maritime retirement seems to have produced better outcomes than simply expecting people to adjust to land life without assistance. The Romans took their typical practical approach to maritime psychology, treating oceanic dream experiences as medical conditions that required systematic treatment rather than spiritual intervention. Roman naval physicians documented what they called maritime melancholia, a condition where retired sailors would experience depression, disorientation, persistent dreams about drowning or sailing, and physical symptoms that resembled seasickness despite being on solid ground. Roman medical treatment for maritime melancholia was surprisingly modern in its approach. They recommended that retired mariners maintain connections to maritime communities rather than making abrupt transitions to completely landlocked lifestyles. Roman physicians understood that the psychological adaptations required for successful oceanic work couldn't be simply abandoned without causing significant mental health problems. Their treatment protocols included gradual career transitions, coastal living when possible, and continued involvement in maritime activities through boat building, harbor management, or mentoring younger sailors. Roman medical texts describe maritime melancholia as a genuine occupational health condition that required professional treatment rather than something that could be resolved through willpower or simple lifestyle changes. During the medieval period, European maritime communities developed the concept of seasickness of the soul, the understanding that some people's spirits were naturally attuned to oceanic rhythms and would become physically and psychologically ill when forced to live entirely on land-based schedules and environments. Medieval monks who worked with retired sailors documented extensive cases of what we now recognize as maritime dream phenomena, but they understood these experiences as natural consequences of oceanic work rather than psychological disorders. They developed sophisticated frameworks for understanding how different types of sea work affected retirement experiences in ways that required different treatment approaches. Deep-sea fishermen had different dream patterns and retirement challenges than coastal traders. Military naval officers experienced different psychological transitions than merchant sailors. Pirates and privateers had particularly intense and violent maritime dreams that often included elements of guilt, supernatural punishment, and unresolved trauma from violent encounters during their criminal careers. Medieval maritime communities had practical solutions for these occupational transition problems. Retired sailors would often become involved in boat building, rope making, sail repair, or other maritime crafts that kept them connected to sea culture without requiring them to actually sail. This maintained their professional identity and social connections while allowing them to use their maritime expertise in land-based work environments. Communities would also organize storytelling sessions where retired mariners could share their sea experiences with younger sailors, community members, and each other. These storytelling gatherings served multiple psychological functions. They helped process traumatic maritime memories, maintained social status for retired sailors, and provided valuable practical education for active mariners who could learn from experienced colleagues' successes and mistakes. Chinese maritime culture developed, perhaps, the most sophisticated understanding of the relationship between sailors and water consciousness that we find in any historical maritime tradition. Traditional Chinese medicine recognized water element personalities, people, whose fundamental energy and psychological constitution were naturally aligned with flowing, changing, and deep psychological states that matched oceanic characteristics. In Chinese medical theory, people with strong water element personalities were naturally drawn to maritime work because their psychological and physical constitution was suited for oceanic environments. But they were also vulnerable to what Chinese physicians called element displacement syndrome when removed from their natural working environments, health problems that occurred when someone's fundamental energy constitution was forced to operate in environments that didn't match their natural elemental alignment. Chinese treatment for element displacement syndrome involves specific dietary therapy designed to maintain internal water element balance, meditation practices that recreated oceanic energy flow patterns within the body, and architectural modifications to living spaces that would reproduce oceanic energy characteristics without requiring actual oceanic proximity. Chinese maritime workers used feng shui principles to design retirement homes that would minimize the psychological disruption of leaving sea life. These homes would incorporate flowing water features that mimicked oceanic movement, curved architectural lines that reproduced wave patterns and tidal flows, and specific color schemes that maintained connection to oceanic energy without triggering traumatic maritime memories or creating longing for dangerous oceanic work. Japanese maritime culture had similar concepts, but focused more on the spiritual aspects of human-ocean relationships rather than the medical and architectural approaches favored by Chinese tradition. Japanese sailors believed that extended time at sea would result in the development of Nami no Kokoro wave consciousness, a psychological state, where human awareness becomes synchronized with oceanic rhythms in ways that create permanent changes in how consciousness operates. The Japanese developed elaborate retirement ceremonies for fishermen and naval personnel that were designed to gradually separate wave consciousness from land consciousness through processes that could take weeks or even months to complete successfully. These ceremonies involved meditation retreats in mountain locations far from oceanic environments, specific dietary changes that would help rebalance body chemistry away from oceanic adaptation, and gradual reintegration into land-based community life through carefully structured social activities. What's fascinating is how much modern maritime psychology research validates these ancient insights about occupational psychological adaptation and retirement transition challenges. Contemporary research on maritime careers shows that sailors do indeed develop measurable neurological adaptations that can make the transition to land life psychologically and physically difficult in ways that match historical descriptions of maritime retirement problems. Modern sleep researchers have documented that people who spend years working on ships develop altered circadian rhythms that are synchronized to oceanic movement patterns rather than solar cycles. Their brains become accustomed to the constant motion of ship life, creating balance and spatial orientation systems that are disrupted by the stability of land-based living in ways that can persist for months or years after retirement from oceanic work. This physiological adaptation explains why many retired sailors report feeling like they're still rocking even when sleeping in beds that don't move. Their inner ears and balance systems continue to expect oceanic motion patterns, creating the sensation of being on a ship even when they're safely on dry land. The adaptation isn't just psychological, it's neurological and physical, involving changes in brain structure and function that develop as responses to prolonged oceanic work environments. Dr. Margaret Helsing at the Maritime Psychology Institute has conducted extensive research on retirement dreams among professional sailors, documenting how maritime dreams serve important psychological functions during career transitions. Her studies show that maritime dreams help process traumatic memories from dangerous sea experiences, maintain psychological connection to maritime identity during retirement adjustment, and gradually help the brain readjust to land-based living patterns through dream rehearsal of terrestrial activities. Helsing's research also confirms that the most effective treatment for disturbing maritime dreams involves gradual transition approaches rather than abrupt retirement from oceanic environments. Sailors who maintain some connection to maritime life through coastal living, boat maintenance hobbies, maritime museums, or mentoring relationships show significantly lower rates of distressing retirement dreams compared to mariners who make complete breaks from oceanic environments. Recent neuroscience research has revealed fascinating connections between water exposure and brain function that might help explain maritime dream phenomena in ways that bridge ancient wisdom and modern scientific understanding. Studies show that people who spend significant time near large bodies of water develop measurably different brainwave patterns than people who live primarily in landlocked environments. The sound of moving water, whether ocean waves, rivers, or even artificial water features, has been shown to induce specific types of brain activity associated with meditative states, enhance creativity, and improve psychological well-being. People who work in maritime environments are essentially receiving daily doses of this neurologically beneficial water exposure, creating brain adaptations that support oceanic work, but that can cause problems when water exposure is suddenly eliminated during retirement. When maritime workers retire to landlocked environments, their brains may experience a form of water sound withdrawal that contributes to unusual dream activity as the sleeping mind tries to recreate familiar oceanic sensory experiences. The brain might be attempting to generate the water-associated brainwave patterns that had become necessary for normal psychological function during oceanic work careers. There's also emerging research on blue mind theory, the scientific concept that proximity to water induces measurably calmer, more creative, and more psychologically balanced mental states. Maritime workers who develop strong blue mind adaptations during their careers might find land-based living psychologically jarring in ways that manifest through dream activity as the sleeping brain tries to recreate the oceanic conditions that had supported optimal mental function. The blue mind research suggests that oceanic exposure creates genuine psychological benefits that go beyond cultural associations or personal preferences. Water environments seem to have measurable positive effects on human consciousness that might be necessary for psychological health in ways that we're only beginning to understand through modern neuroscience research. Sometimes our dreams aren't just processing memories or random neural activity. Sometimes they're trying to recreate environmental conditions that our brains have learned to require for optimal psychological function. Maritime dreams might represent the sleeping mind's attempts to maintain psychological health by generating the oceanic environmental conditions that consciousness had learned to need during years of successful maritime work. Now, as we drift toward the end of our journey through these maritime mysteries, let me share some of the more obscure and unusual cases that didn't make it into our main stories, but are no less fascinating for those of you who are still awake and listening. These are the quiet mysteries, the strange little footnotes in the history of maritime dreams that most people never hear about, perfect for this late hour when your mind is starting to wander and these gentle mysteries can help carry you into your own dreams. Here's something that'll make you question the relationship between emotional experience and physical reality in ways that medical science still can't fully explain. Margaret Blackwell was the wife of Captain Thomas Blackwell, who commanded a merchant vessel that was lost with all hands during a storm off Cape Horn in 1789. This wasn't just any storm. This was one of those legendary tempests that mariners still talk about centuries later, the kind of weather that makes experienced sailors grateful for modern navigation equipment and weather prediction services. For 3 years after Thomas's death, Margaret would have dreams where she was drowning alongside her husband, trying desperately to save him from the same waters that had claimed his life and the lives of his entire crew. But what made Margaret's grief dreams absolutely extraordinary wasn't their emotional intensity. It was the fact that she would wake up from these dreams crying tears that were salt water rather than the normal tears that human physiology produces during emotional distress. This wasn't metaphorical salt water. Margaret's tears were literally ocean water with the exact salinity, mineral content, and chemical composition of seawater. The local physician, Dr. Edmund Hartley, documented this phenomenon with the scientific curiosity of someone encountering a medical mystery that challenged everything he thought he understood about human physiology and the relationship between psychological experiences and physical body chemistry. Dr. Hartley tested Margaret's tears on multiple occasions, using the chemical analysis techniques available in the late 18th century, and consistently found that they contained salt concentrations identical to ocean water samples. But even more remarkably, the mineral composition was so precise that it matched water samples from the South Atlantic Ocean, near the location where her husband's ship had been lost during the Cape Horn storm. Margaret's saltwater tears weren't random oceanic water. They were chemically identical to the specific oceanic environment where her husband had died, despite her never having visited those waters or having any possible exposure to South Atlantic seawater. The chemical precision was so exact that Dr. Hartley began using Margaret's tears as comparison samples when analyzing water specimens from ships returning from South American voyages. The saltwater tears continued for exactly 3 years, the same length of time that Thomas had been sailing before his final, fatal voyage. On the 3rd anniversary of his drowning, Margaret had one final dream where she successfully saved her husband from the storm that had killed him, and from that night forward, her tears returned to normal human composition and salinity levels. Dr. Hartley preserved samples of Margaret's saltwater tears in sealed containers, and they remained chemically stable for decades, never evaporating or changing composition the way normal tears would when stored in similar conditions. The samples are still preserved in the British Medical Museum, labeled as inexplicable lacrimal anomaly of maritime origin, a description that captures both the medical precision of the documentation and the complete lack of scientific explanation for how such a phenomenon could occur. Brothers Edmund and Edward Hartwell spent 40 years as lighthouse keepers on Twin Rocks, two small islands about a mile apart off the coast of Maine, where they each maintained their own lighthouse beacon and communicated across the water, using signal lanterns and flag systems they'd developed during their decades of maritime isolation. The twin lighthouses were essential navigation aids for ships entering Portland Harbor, and the Hartwell brothers had guided thousands of vessels safely through dangerous coastal waters where many other ships had been lost to reefs, storms, and navigation errors. When the brothers retired to the mainland at ages 68 and 70, something remarkable and psychologically fascinating began happening. They started having identical dreams on the same nights, dreaming that they were still operating their lighthouses, but that the two separate lighthouse towers had somehow merged into a single structure that existed simultaneously on both islands, while transcending normal geographical limitations. In their shared dreams, Edmund and Edward could see each other working in the same lighthouse tower, even though they were sleeping in houses 50 miles apart on the mainland. They would dream about maintaining the beacon light together, polishing the lens systems with the methodical precision they developed during 4 decades of lighthouse keeping, winding the clockwork mechanisms that controlled beacon timing, and watching for ships in distress in waters that seemed to extend far beyond the normal geographical boundaries of their main coastal location. But in the dream, their merged lighthouse somehow cast its light across impossible distances, reaching ships that were sailing in oceans that didn't exist in the real world, but that felt more familiar and navigationally significant than the actual waters where they'd worked during their lighthouse careers. They would dream about helping vessels that were clearly from different historical periods, using navigation techniques from various eras, and facing oceanic challenges that exceeded anything they'd encountered during their actual lighthouse keeping experience. The brothers began keeping dream journals independently, not knowing initially that the other was having similar experiences, and when they eventually compared notes, they discovered that their dreams matched in every detail. They were having identical dream experiences, but they were also dreaming about helping the same fictional ships with the same imaginary navigation problems on the same nights, creating a shared professional experience that continued their lighthouse careers in dream environments that were more complex and satisfying than their actual work had been. This shared lighthouse dream experience continued for 5 years, until Edward died peacefully in his sleep in 1828. That same night, Edmund had his final lighthouse dream, but this time he was alone in the lighthouse tower for the first time in decades, and he could see his brother's spirit helping to guide ships from what seemed to be the other side of death, continuing their professional partnership across the boundary between life and whatever comes after. Edmund lived for another 10 years after his brother's death, but he never had another maritime dream of any kind. He said that Edward's death had somehow completed whatever lighthouse work they had been doing in their shared dream world, and his sleeping mind could finally rest peacefully without the responsibility of maintaining navigation aids for impossible ships in impossible waters. Captain Sarah Morrison was one of the first women to command a merchant vessel in American coastal waters, and she had developed an unusual gift that made her services highly sought after by ship owners and merchants who valued cargo safety over social conventions. Sarah could predict weather patterns and ocean conditions by dreaming about them 24 to 48 hours before they actually occurred, with accuracy rates that exceeded the best meteorological instruments and observation techniques available in the mid-19th century. Sarah's weather dreams were remarkably precise and consistently reliable. She would dream about specific storms forming in particular locations, unusual wind patterns that would affect shipping routes, and oceanic conditions that would create either opportunities or hazards for maritime commerce. Her dream-based weather predictions were so accurate that she became an informal weather service for the maritime community along the eastern seaboard, providing storm warnings and safe passage advisories that saved countless ships from weather-related disasters. But what made Sarah's story particularly extraordinary was that after she retired from active sailing, her weather dreams continued and began predicting weather patterns for oceanic locations she'd never visited during her maritime career. She would dream about typhoon formations in the South China Sea, ice conditions in Arctic waters, and hurricane development in the Caribbean, despite having sailed only in North American coastal waters during her actual career. Sarah began sending her weather predictions to maritime authorities in other countries, and her accuracy rates remained consistently high even for weather patterns in oceans she'd never seen. She became an unofficial international weather service, providing meteorological guidance based entirely on her retirement dreams to ship captains working in oceanic environments she knew only through her sleeping visions. The most extraordinary aspect of Sarah's weather dreams was their inclusion of information about long-term climate, patterns that wouldn't be scientifically understood until the 20th century development of global meteorology. She dreamed about what we now recognize as El Niño and La Niña cycles decades before meteorologists identified these patterns, and her journals contain descriptions of global climate interactions that match discoveries made by modern oceanographers and atmospheric scientists. Sarah Morrison died in 1889, but her weather prediction journals remained in use by maritime authorities for years afterward. Sailors would consult her historical weather dreams when planning voyages, and many claim that her predictions remained accurate even decades after her death, as if she had somehow dreamed weather patterns for years into the future and left behind a meteorological guide that continued to provide valuable navigation information long after its creator had passed away. Captain James Fletcher experienced drowning dreams that didn't just violate geographical logic, they violated temporal logic, creating nightmare scenarios where he would drown in the same waters during different historical periods simultaneously, as if his consciousness was somehow accessing multiple timeline versions of the same oceanic location and experiencing death by water in several different eras at once. In Fletcher's most disturbing recurring dream, he would find himself drowning in Portsmouth Harbor, but the harbor would be simultaneously filled with Roman galleys, medieval merchant vessels, 18th century naval ships, and steam-powered vessels from his own era, all occupying the same water space during the same drowning experience but representing completely different historical periods and maritime technologies. Fletcher would experience drowning while being rescued by Roman sailors using techniques that were historically accurate for ancient maritime safety procedures, medieval fishermen employing period-appropriate emergency methods, and modern mariners with contemporary rescue equipment, all simultaneously trying to save him from the same drowning incident that was somehow occurring across multiple centuries of maritime history. The temporal displacement dreams continued for 3 years after Fletcher's retirement, and they seemed to be teaching him comprehensive knowledge about maritime rescue techniques from throughout human oceanic history. When Fletcher died in his sleep in 1870, his bedroom was found filled with rescue equipment from various historical periods, Roman life-saving devices, medieval maritime tools, and contemporary safety equipment, despite his having no collection of historical maritime artifacts during his lifetime. In 1794, the Maritime Merchants Guild of Bristol experienced a collective drowning dream phenomenon where all 47 members had the same nightmare on the same night, dreaming that they were attending their annual guild meeting in a conference room that was somehow located at the bottom of the Bristol Channel, 200 feet underwater, but with the meeting proceeding normally despite the impossible oceanic environment. The guild members would conduct their normal business, discussing shipping routes, cargo prices, and maritime regulations, while breathing water instead of air and surrounded by marine life that seemed to be participating in their commercial discussions. The collective dream would end with all 47 members drowning simultaneously when they suddenly remembered that humans cannot breathe underwater, creating a mass nightmare awakening that was documented by several independent sources. The Bristol Maritime Merchants Guild collective drowning dream occurred exactly 1 week before a major storm destroyed 17 merchant vessels in Bristol Channel, causing financial losses that bankrupted many guild members and effectively ended their organization as a significant force in British maritime commerce. The shared dream seemed to have been a warning about the approaching disaster, but one that could only be understood in retrospect. These obscure cases remind us that maritime dreams aren't just individual, psychological experiences, they're sometimes collective, phenomena that suggest connections between human consciousness and Oceanic environments that operate according to principles we still don't understand. Whether these dreams represent shared access to maritime knowledge, collective responses to environmental changes, or genuine prophecy about future events, they demonstrate that the relationship between sailors and the sea extends far beyond what SEO and L psychology and maritime science can currently explain or predict. If you're somehow still awake at this point, which honestly would surprise me, you've just traveled through some of the strangest waters in human consciousness. The impossible oceans that exist in the dreams of people who've spent their lives working on real water, struggling with currents that flow through bedrooms instead of harbors, and drowning in memories that feel more real than the solid ground beneath their retirement beds. What fascinates me most about these stories is how they show that some experiences go so deep into our consciousness that we never really leave them behind. No matter how far we travel from the environments that shaped us, these sailors might have retired to dry land, bought comfortable houses miles from the nearest drop of seawater, and tried to build new identities as landlubbers, but part of them remained forever at sea, navigating impossible waters in the strange geography of sleep. Maybe that's not such a terrible fate when you think about it. Maybe continuing to dream about the work that defined your life is a form of immortality, your consciousness refusing to completely abandon the experiences that made you who you are. Even when your physical body can no longer handle the dangers and demands of the profession that gave your life meaning and purpose. There's something both beautiful and heartbreaking about Captain Henley waking up soaked in real salt water every morning, or Eleanor Walsh learning advanced navigation techniques while drowning in her own parlor, or those 14 sailors from the Poseidon sharing the same impossible nightmare across hundreds of miles, because their brotherhood had been forged in conditions so intense that even retirement couldn't break the bonds between them. These dreams weren't just random neural activity or psychological processing of old memories. They were ongoing relationships between human consciousness and oceanic environments that had become so fundamental to these people's identities that sleep became the only place where those relationships could continue to exist and evolve. And maybe there's a lesson in that for all of us who've ever had to leave behind work, places, or relationships that defined us. Maybe our dreams aren't just escape mechanisms or memory storage systems. Maybe they're the places where the most important parts of our lives continue to exist long after we've moved on to different circumstances, different locations, different versions of ourselves. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you drifting off in a cozy apartment in Snow Paulo while rain taps against your windows? Falling asleep in a college dorm in Montreal while snow piles up outside? Maybe you're listening from a boat somewhere, which would be wonderfully appropriate given tonight's theme, feeling the gentle rocking motion that these retired sailors could never quite escape even on dry land. Drop a comment and let me know your location, and if you've ever had dreams about places or work that you've left behind, I'd love to hear about those too. Sometimes the most ordinary dreams can be just as fascinating as these impossible maritime nightmares, because they all reveal something about how our minds refuse to let go of experiences that have become part of who we are. And if you found tonight's stories interesting, you might enjoy next week's episode where we'll explore the strange dreams of medieval architects who continued building impossible cathedrals in their sleep long after their earthly construction projects were completed. Same impossible architecture, different kind of drowning in stone and mortar instead of salt water and dreams. Sleep tight, and don't worry if you dream about water tonight. After all these stories about sailors who never quite left the sea behind, it would be perfectly normal to find yourself floating through some impossible ocean, navigating by stars that exist only in the geography of sleep, guided by the voices of retired mariners who are still helping people find their way, home across waters that exist nowhere except in the space between sleeping and waking. See you in your dreams.